All right. Welcome to the inaugural meeting of Philosophy Book Club. We're going over John Rawls' A Theory of Justice, Chapter 1. I'm Chad. I've got Ben here. Say hi, Ben.
Hello. Hi.
um, we're expecting more people, and hopefully they drop in as we get going. And let's start off at the first section. Chapter 1 has 10 sections that it's primarily broken up into. Section 1 is the role of justice. Uh, so this is where he sort of lays out that big quote from the book. Each person possesses an inviolability founded on justice that even the welfare of society as a whole cannot override. And I think that phrase really echoes throughout this whole chapter, and I presume throughout the whole book, because that's really um, something that he thinks that is core to justice, is that we are going to say that they have these rights and that society cannot violate them.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Talks about how societal cohesion and its role between persons was really important. He said it was important that the society is well ordered and not only designed to advance the good of its members, but when it is also effectively regulated by a public conception of justice. So he really thinks that if everybody in the society agrees on what is right and wrong, essentially, that this should translate into a better society.
Mm-hmm.
Which, how can you really argue with that? Like, yeah, of course. One of the big things that you also kind of see throughout the chapter is that he thinks that this thought experiment, the original position, which we'll get into in a few minutes, is that he thinks if someone goes through the thought experiment and comes up with what he, justice as fairness, which is his sort of thesis for what would come out of that. He thinks that anyone who would go through that thought experiment, they would come to these conclusions, and then that would automatically obligate them to those principles that
Mm-hmm.
come out of it. And he seems to just take that as rote, like that's just a
Yeah.
thing that would happen. Um, which later on, when he talks about utilitarianism, he says that one of the big problems with utilitarianism is that it's missing that obligating component.
Mm-hmm.
Um, let's see here. Justice and a shared sense of it are the glue that binds society. That was a big thing that I got out of this first section. Uh, yeah, he talks about a lot of the role of a lot of this section in the role of justice is about how, like I said before, that it's important that society be well ordered about what is just and unjust, because men will, on their own, have different conceptions of what that is, and this will lead to social strife.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I, when reading, because that same quote that you quoted earlier,
Mm-hmm.
I kind of jotted that down as seemed to be, like you said, kind of a overarching theme there. But when he says each person possesses an unvoidability, I feel like that appeals to a certain intuition, I think, in a lot of people. But there was a part of me that's like, how does he come to that conclusion? Like, he does kind of just take that at face value, And because we live in a society that I feel like is largely based on this sort of viewpoint, that like it's easy to just gloss over that and be like, oh well, yeah, of course. But like, are we kind of putting the cart before the horse at that point? Like, it makes intuitive sense to me. I'm sure it made intuitive sense to him. I didn't see, and maybe he addresses this later, but I just didn't see anything that like or does he just say this is a starting point, and if you disagree with me on this, then we're at an impasse already? I don't know.
Yeah, I think. Hey, Preston, thanks for joining us. We can't hear you at the moment. Are you muted? Yep, no problem. Yeah, I think one of his big things, so I wrote this down, even those who would disagree about particular principles of justice would agree that they should be applied equally. So I'm wondering if he thinks that any particular principles that might come out of the thought experiment, that it's just a fact about men that we all want to have these principles, or at least, if we're trying to participate in a society, that we want to have these principles, and that it doesn't matter which ones. I guess we would automatically know what is maybe not strictly just or unjust, but bad or good, I guess. And not good in the way that he uses good, because his difference between right and good. Yeah. At the end of it, this is something I brought up to Aaron in a chat yesterday. At the end of this section, he gives even though later on he's going to say that classical utilitarianism fails for many reasons, he gives a consequentialist reason for choosing between different conceptions of justice. And I thought that was interesting because, Thomas on SIO in his conversations with Aaron, he would always say, well, doesn't deontology just end in utilitarianism? Aren't you just saying that this principle that you've got is the thing that creates the most good? Yeah. Preston, how you doing?
I caught on to that as well, the consequentialism aspect. I have to admit that all this philosophy stuff is still pretty new to me from watching all these shows, but it's kind of cool seeing the different things that I like have picked up on here and there coming up and being like, oh, that's consequentialism and whatnot. I don't know, like, I feel like it's pretty obvious from that that sentence that Rawls seems to be a consequentialist.
Yeah, which I guess is different than utilitarianism generally, because he even says he's only harping on classical utilitarianism, which is about strictly sort of the greatest good for the greatest number as applied to an entire society.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the short story Those Who Walk Away from Omaha?
No, what's that?
I remember reading it in university. It's a just pretty short story, but the basic conceit is there's this society, and like one person gets chosen to like receive this like horrible abuse and punishment, and in return the rest of the society is like happy and healthy and whatever. And then people, when they come of age, learn that, and then they have to choose whether they want to stay there or leave.
Sure.
And it just, I remember it was pretty influential just to me in my early years, early 20s, late teens, and as like a pretty classic example of utilitarianism. So like it always comes into my head when I think of that classical utilitarianism sort of argument, and it just popped into my head when it seems like what he's proposing is more or less a pretty like kind of runs right against that whole conceit of society, because no one would want to be that one person, right? So
Mm-hmm.
then
So no one would
you
agree
don't
with
want.
that system.
Exactly, yeah. So it just was it always stuck in my head because of how like stark an example of utilitarianism it was. And so anytime, especially how society is structured, it pops into my head every once in a while. So
Yeah,
it's worth a read. It's pretty short though. But.
sure. Preston, how's your audio doing? We can't hear you. Um, to the left of your little phone symbol on the screen, is it whited out with a cross through it? Because it seems to me that you're muted on the screen. Because I can see a no microphone thing. But that might just mean that it doesn't detect your microphone. All right. Well, he's figuring that out. We'll move on to the. Do you have anything else, Ben, about the first section?
Oh, I think we covered most of the notes that I made there.
Okay. We'll move on to section 2, the subject of justice. Boy, I love that I can hardly read my own writing. So he talks about social justice, and he says it is about how we arrange the rights surrounding if I can read this. Surrounding freedom of thought and liberty of conscience, competitive markets, private property, and the family unit. So he thinks that it's primarily around the rights surrounding those things. He gets into, because he thinks one of the big reasons why he has this liberal intuition of we need to, the most well-off need to help the least well-off. He actually gives a pretty good moral luck argument. And props to Aaron for turning everybody on to that, because I see it all day, every day now.
Totally.
But yeah, let's see. The intuitive notion here is that this structure contains various social positions, and that men born into different positions have different expectations of life determined, in part by the political system as well as by economic and social circumstances. In this way, the institutions of society favor certain starting places over others. These are especially deep inequalities. Not only are they pervasive, but they affect men's initial chances in life, yet they cannot possibly be justified by an appeal to the notions of merit or desert. It is these inequalities, presumably inevitable in the basic structure of any society, to which the principles of social justice must be in the first instance apply. These principles then regulate the choice of a political constitution and the main elements of an economic and social system. The justice of a social scheme depends essentially on how fundamental rights and duties are assigned and on the economic opportunities and social conditions in the various sectors of society. So yeah, he definitely thinks that, much like in the last part when he's saying everyone should, everyone would agree to the different principles, and that's what obligates them towards it. I think he's also saying here that that if the society is not tending to their needs, that would lessen social cohesion, and that people starting off in different spots would be advantaged differently and would therefore participate in the social system differently. Let's see here. He talks about it that that this theory, and he talks about this in the first section as well, but that his justice as fairness, the principles that come out of it, are probably limited in what they apply to. Um, but he thinks that this isn't a problem, only that whatever they apply to, that would elucidate further cases that they could be applied to, I guess. Like he thinks that this is a stepping stone to further understanding of how you would order a society in the ways that this doesn't address. Yeah, he says this conception mostly considers strict compliance. So he's assuming. All right, Preston, have a good one. He's assuming that people will be on board with it, and that's how it would work. Because he talks about he's not going to talk about partial compliance because that would I'm gonna start needing to get those sticky bits that you can put in a book that mark your notes.
Totally.
I've never been one to write inside of a book. But I've had friends who are like big underliners and writing notes in the margins and those sorts of things.
That's how I am, and it's frustrating me because I'm borrowing this book, so I'm not marking it all up, and I'm like, ah.
That's funny. Yeah, I'm not much of a note taker, but this, I guess I've just never done many philosophy texts, and they kind of necessitate writing notes.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Oh, here we go. Obviously, the problems of partial compliance theory are pressing and urgent matters. These are the things that we are faced with in everyday life. The reason for beginning with an ideal theory, or the strict compliance, is that it provides the only basis for a systemic grasp of these more pressing problems. Yeah.
I wonder if he addresses the subject of partial compliance later or whatnot, because that's a big question that I have, is how steady is this particular sort of structure? Like, if one or two people don't comply to it, does it all fall apart, or does it require a plurality or a majority of people?
Yeah, I can't remember, and I swear it was from a cartoon that I watched when I was younger. That was, I don't know, I can't remember what the cartoon was, but I don't remember it being anything live action or from a book or anything. But it was talking about people who, criminals and things like that, and it was referring to them as like parasitizers, and essentially like any system of mutual cooperation can survive a certain amount of parasitization, but that if too many people are parasites, obviously it'll be overrun. That's been in my head for years, and I just don't remember where it was from.
Interesting.
Let's see.
It's a good analogy, though.
Yeah.
I'm a biologist by training, zoologist specifically, so that makes a lot of sense. Like, fish get too many sea lice in their gills, certain parasite load crashes the whole thing, if they can handle it up to a certain point.
Yeah. Yeah, the only thing is I don't remember, again, what it was from, but I don't like the idea, because in applying it to what Rawls is talking about, I think the parasitizers could be considered criminals and those who would try to game the system, but it would also encompass people who are turning to criminality because their participation in society is not garnering them, like the poor, essentially. The poor or the generally disenfranchised. And so, I mean, while it's probably in a scientifically appropriate term when you're talking about like behavior, I guess, calling them parasites, I think, is probably problematic.
It's certainly a morally loaded term, which is why I wouldn't use the term outside of the metaphor.
Right.
Even then, the metaphor is a little cringy, but yeah. I was even thinking less on the criminal side of things and more on the side of, um, because the whole concept of this is, like you said, people, like people who are better off recognizing that and doing their part to help the people who aren't, um, and like that isn't even necessarily illegal.
Hmm.
To like, you don't have to not help people, but like for the, society cohesion to work, you have to have at least some of those people to want to help people. And then that's kind of what raised the question of, well, like if every single person who makes $1 million doesn't want to give back, at what point does that collapse it, right?
Yeah, in the middle of reading this chapter, I was thinking about that exact same thing because I have I don't know, I wouldn't call him a friend because we don't talk very much. Um, uh, it's and I don't have him friended on Facebook because I know it would just be nonstop argument, and he's a friend of another friend, and he's
Yes.
the worst kind of originalist and
Oh yeah.
like toxic libertarian, and
Mm-hmm.
it's funny, he is not a utilitarian, and he's made that very clear. He does not like utilitarianism at all. He thinks it's all like basic principles. Um, but he is very much of the mind because he's also a minarchist. So he thinks the government should be as minimal a state as possible. Um,
Okay.
and he thinks that the government should not be in the business of social welfare, essentially, and
Mm-hmm.
that it should entirely be up to private, like charities and organizations like that, to do that kind of thing. Um, and he has never given me a good account because I just like put it to him. I'm like, we currently have a system of governmental social welfare and charities, and we are
Mm-hmm.
not getting everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And like these problems are still rampant. So,
Mm-hmm.
how do you think um, this will be addressed if we take out the institutional version of it?
Yeah. I know what they want to answer. What they want to answer is, oh, you free up more capital, people will have more capital to spend. But that's not going
Right.
to happen. You know what's not going to happen. Like, they're already not filling the gap as it
Right. We
is.
have tons of capital currently, and we have
Exactly.
this shortfall.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was definitely something I was thinking about in this.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, let's see. He talks about the character of a just person. And he says persons are thought to be just insofar as they have a steady desire to act justly, which I thought was a weird way to define that.
Yeah.
Because basically, a just person is a just person, is how I took that essentially.
Yeah.
But he thinks it's like it's a permanent. I think what he thought of it was that a just person is a person who is consistently just, because he says it's a permanent element of their character, and they have a steady and effective desire to do so.
Mhm.
Um, uh, yeah, that a person would refrain from pleonexia, which is an old classical term, essentially meaning gaining for yourself what you have taken from another person. So essentially, like crime,
Mhm.
or denying a person what is due to him,
Mhm.
and not fulfilling contracts. So anyone who refrains from that is probably a just person. All right, we'll move on to section 3, which is the main idea of the theory of justice. This is where he sets out the original position, um, and how you can, if you put the original position into practice, you can derive from it the first principles by which you can build society on. And just to go over it, the original position is you're supposed to think of this primordial pre-existence, wherein I think Aaron called it the constitutional convention of souls. We're all in this pre-existence. We do not know any of our you do not know what advantage or disadvantages you would have in the life that's coming. You don't know what social circumstances you're being born into, or anything about yourself. But I had just weird questions about it, because he says, maybe this is in a later section, but it's clear that he's thinking that you really don't know what about yourself. You just know what you do and don't want out of the world. But are you ignorant of of the temperament that you would be born into?
I think I remember him mentioning, like, oh, and you might not be, but he didn't really seem to, like, put a hard stance on that. But I remember him mentioning that about, like, something about your temperament or can't remember where it is now, though. I remember having that same question.
Yeah, I wonder if he gets into it later in the book, because this title, the section of the title, is the main idea of the theory of justice, so I assume it goes into further detail.
Yeah, totally. Oh, here we go. He says, yeah. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good or special psychological propensities.
Okay, so that must mean that you're ignorant of your temperament.
Mm-hmm. That's how I read it, at least.
So I find that surprising, because just thinking of the spectrum of what one could be. So I started thinking of if you were in this group of souls trying to make these decisions, what kind of world do we want to set up so that when we go into it, so they want it so that if you are advantaged, you want to be as advantaged as possible, probably, right? Mm-hmm. And if you go in disadvantaged, you want the society to help you along, I guess. Mm-hmm. You don't want to be going in with no help. But the one thing I was thinking about was, so a person who, the maxim where the most advantaged help the least advantaged, what about the people who enter disadvantaged, but in spite of the disadvantages thrive, and but through lots of work they overcome the disadvantaged to be in an advantaged position? I think that group would be less likely to assent to the system that he may or may not put forth. Again, we're only in the preliminary section of the book, so I'm wondering how he answers that question. Because I could definitely see, if you're disadvantaged, you want a world that would help you out. If you're advantaged, you just don't want the world to take from you. You want a world where you can stay advantaged. But if you are put into the world disadvantaged, but you are, just a workhorse, lots of grit, and you're able to overcome the disadvantaged, would you think it unfair that you've done all this work to get into the advantaged, whereas presumably the advantaged people were just given that? So
I do think, the concept, he uses the term the veil of ignorance to describe you don't know anything. Well, I would imagine that because you're not, when you're sitting there in the what was the term that you used?
though, the Constitutional
Yeah,
Convention of Souls.
yeah. On the one side of the veil of
This
ignorance,
gathering.
you don't know whether you're going to be one of the people who one of the disadvantaged who can work to become advantaged,
Mm-hmm.
or whether you're going to be one of the disadvantaged who needs to like take part in the social safety net or whatever, however it looks.
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't know if you're going to have that psyche or that ability to do that, or if the things are going to come about in your life that will give you those opportunities. So I feel like that just is part of the calculus, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, well, some of those people are going to be it. Like, sure, maybe you might look back and be like, oh man, were I to have known then that I would have been one of the people who could work up, well, maybe I would have leaned more towards let's benefit the advantaged. But on the one side of veil of ignorance, you don't really know, right? So like you want some safeguards in there, I would imagine, or at least I would if that were me. Like,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, it's an interesting question though.
Yeah, just because in the spectrum, you're going to have selfish, disadvantaged people, I guess, would be a way to put it. Um, and so, I mean, I can see where selfish, if you're trying to make up these rules, you try to placate the selfish, advantaged people because they're already going to be in this high position, and they need to assent to this society you're building. So you need to give them something. So we're not going to like radical income redistribution, but some, I guess, because that's part of the theory. Yeah, I don't know. We'll put that aside because it's probably something that comes up later in the book.
Yeah, I do think part of it is addressed with the veil of ignorance, though, because no one knows that they're going to be one of those people. So,
right, but in that veil of ignorance stage, they're considering what type of world they're building, and so I guess I'm trying to put myself. Okay, I'm a soul, and I'm just thinking of any types of people that I could become in the next world. What do I want? Like, yeah, I guess I want maximum fairness, but with the spectrum being as it is fair to the disadvantaged and fair to the advantaged going to cover the person who crosses the threshold in their lifetime?
You're saying it could end up disproportionately favoring that type of person. Yeah. No, that's good. That's a good point. I can definitely see that.
Which I think he says is the case, and I think as a liberal, that's kind of something we take on. Like, we got to give more to the people who don't have more. I'm just wondering how he ends up justifying it later, I guess.
Yeah.
Let's see here. The intuitive idea is that everyone's well-being depends on a... I really need to write better.
On a scheme of cooperation,
yes,
without which no one could have a satisfactory life.
Yes. And I think I wrote that down because I think he also, and I think this too, that an individual all by themselves in the state of nature will not have as good a life as someone inside of a community. Just because there can be division of labor, you have more time for more things, and obviously you get up to a society and we have leisure products and free time and all that kind of stuff. And I think that I definitely agree with that, but so I try to take this back. What if you were doing this in a not pre-society but pre-mass society? Like, what if you thought you were going into like a tribal situation, or just like really small communities, and if you thought you were a person, you were sort of rolling the dice that once you entered the world, you were a like super capable, survivalist, man of the wilderness kind of person who could be happy with
Mm-hmm.
living in the state of nature all on your own.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think he takes it as rote that anyone would assent to being a part of society and
I
therefore assent to
yeah.
these principles.
I I could be wrong, but I feel like in one of the earlier sections he makes that stipulation, like
Mm-hmm.
this doesn't work in those other situations, like this works in a society as we know it now. I
Sure.
think. Like
Okay.
I said, I'm a
I
little
know.
rusty on that, but
Now that you say that, I think you're right. Yeah.
but
I'll have to go
but
back and look. But yeah, I
yeah,
think you're definitely right about that.
I didn't write down the actual phrase, but I feel like I remember reading that. But
Oh, here's my note about what I said. I paraphrased, says those with good moral luck should keep those with bad moral, or excuse me, should help those with bad moral luck.
hmm
I'm not sure if this takes into account those who have thrived despite bad luck. Yeah.
yes, yes.
He also says, because he thinks that justice's fairness is definitely a social contractarianism
hmm
theory. And he lays out that social contractarianism generally is better than utilitarianism and perfectionism. Let's see here. Can I start on the next page? Yep. Yeah, in the last paragraph, it's like it's not a complete contract theory.
hmm
Certainly, principles just related to them. He doesn't discuss the virtues in a systematic way. Yeah, he doesn't think that his theory is pointing out what should be the case. Um, he's just pointing out that this thought experiment would lead you as close as possible to what would be like a good virtue.
hmm Yeah, it's almost like he's laying out less the end point and more at which which you take to get to the end point. That's what it seems by just even the way that he couches some of the things that he says.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like he's like, well, this isn't any, specific like prescription or anything, but it's a way to get to something. If you value this thing that we're calling justice, if you value that, this is a path you can use to get to what would be a moral end, rather than this is a moral end in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Yeah,
know if
I think he thinks it's a way to form the contract. It is not a
Mhm.
contract itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's actually, thinking back on the first section there, that makes sense, kind of what he was saying um in the first, probably the first section, or the first couple sections, is he's like, well, everybody has a different view of justice and whatever, like it all depends on kind of what you decide, like, together,
Mm-hmm.
rather than like, this is my view of justice.
Yeah, and I'm reading a paragraph here. He says it's an example of what I have called contract theory, but there could definitely be an objection to the
Mm-hmm.
term contract. Let's see. Uh, the merit of the contract terminology is that it conveys the idea that principles of justice may be conceived as principles that would be chosen by rational persons, and in that
Mm-hmm.
way, conceptions of justice may be explained and justified. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've actually I've listened to people talk about contractarianism and about moral obligation, um, and I'm kind of convinced that social contractarianism has nothing to hang its hat on in terms of obligation, because it just assumes people would assent to it,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't give, I don't, at least I don't think that it gives a good account of why anyone would be obligated toward the contract.
Mm-hmm.
um, but I have heard other theories of good stuff, but I think we'll do that in another on our next book or something.
Yeah.
All right, we'll move on to the next section. The original position and justification. This is where he sets out the original position, and also of justification. Let's see here. What would I write down? He thinks that this, his main thing is that the strength of the original position is lies in the ignorance of the participants, and it affords them that the strength is that it affords them strength in coming to fair decisions. That's what he thinks the strength of it is. That because they just don't know what they're going to be getting into, it should lead them to create a maximally fair system. Oh, okay, yeah. This is where I put all my questions about. Do we assume that their ignorance of their future self means that they are also... see, this was something... you can be ignorant of what you are, what your future self will be like, but does that mean you, the decider, in that sense, you, that ignorant self, are you free of that temperament that you might have later? Like, are you not yourself at all? I guess is what's supposed to be the case.
Yeah.
Which I guess is what you read, the that you are free from your psychological propensities. That you're supposed to think of yourself as having no... But doesn't that free you of also caring about fairness?
Yeah, it does kind of seem to spiral into oblivion when you really try and draw those connections. I wonder if that's just getting too nitpicky, or...
Yeah. Like, is it just a part of the thought experiment that you're supposed to think that you guys are fairness-minded when you're going through this?
Yeah. Because, really, in the end, it is just a thought experiment, so you put certain constraints on it, and that's just how it goes. And if you don't accept those constraints, then what are you going to do?
Yeah.
But that would be an interesting question for somebody who maybe has a more holistic understanding of this, like maybe Aaron.
Yep. He says that justice cannot be arrived at through self-evident principles, but rather that the considerations must mutually support each other in a coherent view. Yeah, so he thinks that you can't... Which I think implies that he doesn't think that there's objective morality, I guess?
Yeah.
Or that at least justice, there's no objective justice.
Yeah.
That you guys, that the people, that the fairness, I guess, would be the justice. Which I guess why it's called justice as fairness. Make vivid to ourselves the restrictions that it seems reasonable to impose on arguments for principles of justice, and therefore in these principles themselves. Thus it seems reasonable and generally accepted that no one should be advantaged or disadvantaged by natural... Yeah, that's just the sort of liberal principle that he's going over there. That it's not okay that people are born disadvantaged, and so we should work to alleviate that. Actually, I had surprisingly little notes for this section.
One thing that I will interject here, it kind of applies to the whole concept of the original position and veil of ignorance and all that stuff, is it's interesting how much he takes empathy for granted in all of this, because it does kind of require at least a certain level of empathy, because to be able to sit back and be like, oh, well, I could be born as a whatever, insert a disadvantaged group, that requires you to be able to put yourself in their shoes. So I can see how this whole concept wouldn't necessarily make a lot of sense to someone who is not particularly empathetic, because they're like, oh, well, that's not me. And like, but it's also interesting how it kind of grabs your hand and leads you down the path of like viewing things empathetically, even if you don't actually have empathy.
Mm-hmm.
It like kind of gently guides you down that, like, well, this, like, it's intuitive to say you or I having, I know I have a fair amount of empathy, so it's not very hard for me to grasp. But it's interesting to see how, like, he kind of does painstakingly grab your hand and walk you down this path of, like, which is why some of it maybe feels so, like, just intuitive of, like, oh, well, of course you'd want to, as much fairness or whatever. And just one thing that really popped out at me, like, there are people who maybe really wouldn't get it at all, and like kind of need all those steps laid out for them.
Yeah, there's definitely, I think the veil of ignorance, I think, is really the like you said, that the ignorance of the participants is really the big thing. And personally, I think this would need to be explained to the blank souls, like, hey, this existence you're going into, you don't know where you're going to be. So you can be a rich person, and sure, if you're going to be a rich person, you might want to make a society that treats rich people really nicely. But you could also be like a poor, infirm, disabled, whatever person. And if you're not going to have a good life, that's not going to be a good thing. And so you want to order society that if you do happen to pop up into that, the society does its best to give you a good life, whatever that should mean for you. So I guess that kind of forces empathy on you, in an empirical sense, I guess, or in a sort of evidentiary way, like it's saying, you don't need to feel bad for people who are disadvantaged, you just have to imagine yourself in their position, which I guess is empathy. And that you'd essentially, if you were in that position, you wouldn't like it. You would like someone to help you.
It would be really interesting to get the viewpoint of a more bootstrapper type of person, because this is like seems to be pretty directly contradictory to the bootstrapping sort of argument. See like where they come out provided this thought experiment, because like I imagine their gut reaction would be like, oh, well, if I were born at the whatever, I would just pull myself up by the bootstraps, and I would be one of those people like you were talking about that is able to do whatever. And like, yeah, but you don't know that. That's the whole point. And like I just feel like there are some people who are just going to be at that impasse of like, no, well, I would just be that person. Like, yeah, but you don't know that. That's the whole.
Yeah, I get the feeling that, because, again, I get that, I come across that argument so much, that, like, this sort of, that the universe should just be a big meritocracy, and, you will get what you deserve based on the work you put in, or essentially, so if you don't put in any work, but I think those are just, there's no moral luck to them. They don't get that concept, and so there's a not disdain, but there's a judgment that's going on there, or like they don't they want a system that would punish laziness, I guess. But I guess, but that's because they're perceiving those things as laziness and maybe not as infirmity or whatever. Because I can see like a person who is deeply depressed just can't do these things, can't participate properly in order to further the societal goals, and so therefore won't reap the benefit. And I could see that laziness would be something that would be attributed to that person.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. As a person who deals with severe depression, yeah, it happens a lot. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, well, you're just not trying hard enough, blah blah blah, and yeah, it did. And like, there's a certain point where people maybe just can't grasp that, like, understand that there are things that appear to be laziness or appear to be these character flaws that perhaps are not as much character flaws as they think they are, and then that does kind of lead to a, like, until you really understand it, or at least have someone explain it to you, like, it can, yeah, lead to that sort of viewpoint.
Yeah, I gotta tell you, fresh out of high school, I was definitely that sort of bootstrapper libertarian.
Me
And
too.
I think it's an attractive thing for
Yeah.
able-bodied young men.
Mhm.
Because like, I'm privileged like a motherfucker.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh yeah, why don't you just stop being depressed? Duh.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, thank you. Yeah. There's not much more to say about that. It's just it's an ignorance, but the thing is, it took me learning about things, and it also it actually took experience, because I'm not a person who generally has depression, but I definitely had one particular bout of it where I was literally just sitting in my computer chair. It was the middle of the day. I had just had a bad breakup. And
Yes.
and it wasn't just sadness, because I had already cried my eyes out, was very sad. But I was literally just sitting in my chair. I had like YouTube or something on, but nothing was playing, and I was just like, I don't want to move. I don't like. I have no will to act, and I was like, this has to be depression, because this is new.
Yeah.
All right. No more shitting on libertarians for now.
Now.
I'm sure that'll come up later in the book.
Oh, definitely.
We'll move on to the next section, which is classical utilitarianism. And this is where he tries in a really nice way to say he doesn't like utilitarianism.
Yep.
So he defines it as a utilitarian system would be arranged so as to achieve the greatest net balance of satisfaction summed over all individuals. And I think, because I was talking to Aaron about this, that yeah, this is a straw bot. This is like, he chose. Now, granted, he says it's this Sidgwick and who was the other person? Two people that wrote about utilitarianism in economics and also something else, and Pigou, I think. And so it's not like he's picked a run-of-the-mill utilitarianism that he doesn't like. It seems that there were people forwarding this particular version in the literature, and I assume it was popular if he devoted a whole section to it. But I have a hard time thinking that people who were really thinking about this and writing about it thought that the greatest net balance summed over all individuals was an appropriate version of that. Because that seems like just a cursory understanding of mathematics would show you that, like, if I have a 100, 3 100s and 4 1s, the average is going to be somewhere in the like 200s. Like, it's not going to be anywhere near 1.
Yeah.
And so, like, oh yeah, we got, like, great stuff there. But we have all these 1s. Like, no, we can't have 1s. 1s are bad. Like, that would be the non-utility. And so, I mean, I'm just I'm not going to argue against a book that I'm reading, but it just seems to be that the utilitarianism that he's arguing against is specifically it's almost the opposite of what he's arguing for, and I think that's why he set it up to knock it down. Because because he doesn't want the greatest net balance summed over individuals. He wants the greatest like average, I guess, with also a floor.
Yeah. And also, it seems like mobility within those numbers is important to him as well, right? So, like, sure, if you have 3 100s and 3 1s, your average is 50. And that's obviously not an ideal situation. That makes sense, some intuitive sense. But on the same hand, you want those ones to be able to increase.
Yeah.
Right? And the calculus gets a lot more complicated when you're like, okay, well, certain things may cause the ones to be able to increase a lot, but that might cause the hundreds to drop down a whole bunch, and that mobility seems to be just like a keystone aspect of this whole concept, and that just makes the math of all of that way more complicated, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because reality is far more complicated. And that has always been my problem with utilitarianism in general too, is it seems like it's to just plug in the numbers and you get the right answer out, which is appealing as a scientist, but not. I don't know. But yeah, I just that mobility really like jumps out at me. Like, you're not going to necessarily be stuck at a 1 or a 100, and you want your ones to be able to rise as far as possible and limit the amount that affects the higher numbers, right? And pull that all up to a 75. Maybe you pull all those ones up to 50s.
Yeah, I wonder if in this just numerical thinking about it, if he thinks that, like, because he definitely argues that you shouldn't be taking rights from people just to help a couple people. I think he definitely doesn't think that.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, does that mean, like, in the 300s, 3-1s example, does that mean he would not be okay with 650s? Like, or leveling that to 650s? Or does he think it's right to, like, make the 300s drop down to 95 if it raises the ones up to 30, let's say? Let's just say the numbers don't correlate the same.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's a good point that you make there, that the numbers may not correlate. Dropping the hundreds down by 5 may raise the ones up, just because it's not necessarily a linear relationship. And that's one of my other issues with utilitarianism, is that idea of, like, thinking it in at least this broad strokes like this, is it's not necessarily a linear relationship,
right?
And like, you can see that as far as like taxes go. Like, you can tax the fuck out of the really rich people and it hardly affects them, but like tiniest little difference will make a massive change for everybody down below. Which it's easy for people to think like, oh, straight tax, everybody gets taxed 20% or whatever, when that's stupid. That's just dumb, because that's not how things work. Right? But
yeah, I'm always so I used to listen to, like, Adam Carolla's podcast, but right around the election, he would just have, like, he had all of the, I think all but 2 of the Republican primary candidates on his show to talk. So he had, like, Ted Cruz, he had Trump, he had I think he had Marco Rubio, and I think one other person, but I can't remember. But also around that time, he had been, I mean, this has been doing for a while, and it's because he lives in California, and he thinks the taxes are too he thinks the taxes are too high in relation to what they appear to be getting out of it.
Okay.
So not that they're just generally too high, just that why are we paying so much if we have shit schools, of shit roads, et cetera, et cetera. And one of his things was he hated people saying that rich people should pay their fair share, because he's like, I pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes, or however much, and he's like, and they don't, the people at the bottom, they don't pay anything. So what exactly is my fair share in regards to that? And I always thought that was a it's a poor formulation of that. 'Cause, the I think what people are saying when they say pay their fair share, is just means that like, oh, you've gotten more out of this system, you should pay more back into it.
Mm-hmm.
And that the scale at which you paying, you have a person who lives at the poverty line versus a person who makes like $400,000. If you need to pay $1,000 in taxes, that's not gonna hit the 400,000 guy at all, maybe.
Yeah.
Whereas that could ruin the life of the person at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. I never liked that form of
Yeah,
argumentation.
I remember thinking about it on the way home from work one time for some reason, and I sat down and was trying to draw, because I'm a real data graphs sort of person. And I was trying to draw out my conception, not with any real numbers, but my conception of like, so like 20% for $1 million and 20% for $30,000 have different impacts, even though the percentage, because it seems equal, right? Oh, everybody gives the same percent,
Right.
but the impact of that 20% is greater. So it's almost like it's not just a straight curve, and it's not just a straight line, and it's not just a curve either. There's actually like inflection points and stuff where impact is greater, even though, and it just seems counterintuitive, I think. And I don't know enough about math, or don't remember enough about math anymore to come up with a real like visualized concept of it, but I feel like that applying then that to utilitarianism kind of makes sense, in that there could be different inflection points around greater or lesser utility where things make a larger difference. And it's hard to know without any practical experience either, right? Like, and everything you do might be slightly different as well.
Yeah, I also in here he talks about satisfaction being the metric.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure that would be the metric you'd want to go by. And I assume he says satisfaction because the people in the utilitarian book he's talking about say satisfaction. But I took several things here. So he calls utilitarianism a teleological argument or theory, and that means it's an explanation for something as a function of its ends, purposes, or goals. So essentially, it's good because of what it does, essentially. But he talks about eudaimonia, which is a term I've heard before. It means happiness or flourishing. It's an ancient Greek word. And they think it's closer to flourishing than it is to happiness, but it essentially means like a good life. Like, are you satisfied? Are you contented? Are you healthy? Are you etc.? And essentially, if you want to work towards eudaimonia, and I think that's probably a better metric, like how close you are to that, how satisfied and contented you are with your life. Which I guess is satisfied, but
it just seems more holistic than the term satisfied. I know what you mean. Just hearing it kind of makes you go, it's not quite as all-encompassing as you would expect for...
Yeah, because I can assume you'd want something that was less subjective than satisfaction. Like, because I could see like that classic, like sweets, that super sweet 16. You have this teenager who is like, has ice sculptures and crazy catering and getting a new car, and like this small thing is out of place. And they're not satisfied with that. But from the outside, you could see, they got it good.
Yeah, satisfaction does seem to have baggage around it, as far as like the relative to the situation, right? Like it just doesn't seem like a very concrete metric, I guess.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's see. He talks about again that conceptions of so now he's talking about good instead of just justice, but he thinks conceptions of what are good also cannot be arrived at self-evidently. He says. Let's see if I can find this section. Yeah, these sections where he talks about the spectator, I, my mind wasn't grasping what he meant by it, which I guess is this was supposed to be the hypothetical person making the judgment.
Okay.
Yeah, it comes up at the end of this section and also I think later on in section 7, I think. But I don't know, the spectator part I didn't quite grasp. Because he says, "For it is by the conception of the impartial spectator and the use of sympathetic identification in guiding our imagination that the principle for one man is applied to society." So I think he's saying, yeah, okay, so he's saying that utilitarianism is this hypothetical spectator who would say that the use of identification in guiding our imagination that the principle for one man is applied to society. So I think this hypothetical spectator is supposed to represent what would be good for all because it's good for the one guy in his own life. That doesn't make sense to me.
Goes on to say here, it is this spectator who is conceived as carrying out the required organization of the desires of all persons into one coherent system of desire. It is by this construction that many persons are fused into one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still not sure exactly.
He's the perfectly rational individual who identifies with and experiences the desires of others. So is he saying that the spectator is supposed to represent the person who believes everyone is satisfied? Like, he's conflating that subjective satisfaction, like this hypothetical person would be the one that applies it to everyone?
To me, it sounds like he's personifying utilitarianism itself, saying like, oh, imagine that, like, to create the a maximum utility in a system, you have to pretend that there's this impartial but sympathetic spectator, because they have to be sympathetic to one.
Oh, that's right. And then the last line, it says utilitarianism does not take seriously the distinction between persons. So it doesn't care who is having a bad time. It only cares that more people are having a good time.
Exactly, that the total number ends up resulting in a higher number than a lower number.
Okay. I understand that a little bit.
Yeah, that's kind of what I pick up through that. It's a little confusing but it sounds like he's personifying utilitarianism, or on the other hand, that's you putting yourself, if you were playing a game or something, and you're the one making the maximum utility or whatever, that would be you thinking about how to structure everything. Or if you were thinking about how should our society work, then that's how I read it, at least.
I think that's right. Yeah. All right. Let's move on to the next section. It's some related contrasts, And throughout this section, he is so in the last section he was talking specifically about utilitarianism. In this section he is letting utilitarianism and the original position bounce off each other, and talking about what the strengths and weaknesses of each are in particular situations. So he says, so he doesn't think utilitarianism is justice, first of all, because he thinks justice is something else. And I'm not sure if he just means what his conception of it, or if he means that in particular, because he doesn't think, because he says his main phrase again, each member of society, inviolability founded on justice, or he says, or on a natural right, which even the welfare of everyone else cannot override. So he paraphrases it a little bit. And it says, justice denies that the loss of freedom for some can be made right by the greater good shared by others. So he thinks justice would not allow the curtailing of rights for a few for the benefit of others. And utilitarianism would totally allow this. And he definitely sees that as a bad thing. And putting it so simply, yeah, one would disagree with that. But I think, and I wonder if it, I asked this to Aaron, and he couldn't remember whether or not it comes up, but I'm wondering if he sets justice as fairness against those big society questions, like the whole, like, you know, would we kill one person to save the entire world, like, kind of questions. And I'm wondering if he lets this bump up against anything like that.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to see how that flushes out, because that, yeah, you're right, that is an interesting, because he does kind of hammer on utilitarianism a lot, but then there are certain questions like that where you're like, well, how, like, now put your concept to use, right? And it's hard to say. And although, you know, having only read this far, his question might be, well, that's something that everybody has to come to a consensus about themselves. He kind of opens with that of, like, everybody's concept of justice is different, and it's up to society for everybody to hash that out for themselves. So that could be his answer. It's a little unsatisfactory, but that might be his answer. But there's a lot of book left. We might get to it.
Exactly. He makes some interesting points about utilitarianism in this section. So he says utilitarianism only cares about satisfaction, but not about, not what one is satisfied about. And I think that's part of one of the reasons why he thinks utilitarianism is not a form of justice. But he also says that if you would imagine yourself in the original position, it doesn't exclude you from choosing utilitarianism. So he doesn't think that it's a foregone conclusion that people would not choose utilitarianism. He just thinks that it's unlikely that people in that position would choose it.
Yeah.
But he also thinks, so in his theory, interests that would violate justice, which I thought was weird, because he thinks that the fairness so I mean, he talks about his own the original position and the principles that come out of it, so I assume he's talking about the principles. So he says interests that would violate those principles have no value and therefore cannot override its claims, which I was confused about what he meant by that. I got more notes. So it seems like, so like we said earlier, he doesn't think that justice is fairness, or the original position specifically, is about telling you what the virtues are, it's about leading you in a path to figure out what they are,
Mm-hmm.
for you to come to your own conclusion about what they are. Now, I think
Mm-hmm.
later in the book he's going to say you would reasonably come to XYZ virtues,
Yeah.
um, but he's not saying that the thought experiment on its own sets those virtues. He's just saying
Mm-hmm.
if you go through it, you will probably end up with these virtues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he says, for it is assumed that a person in the original position would choose a principle of equal liberty and restrict economic and social inequalities to those in everyone's interests, and there is no reason to think that just institutions will maximize the good. Of course, it is not impossible that the most good is produced, but it would be a coincidence. so, so he's saying, I think he's saying that utilitarianism uh, could come out with the best or the most good, but that it would be a coincidence.
Yeah.
Because in justice and fairness, there is no maximum principle used. You're just trying to aim for fairness, which I guess would be the greatest net satisfaction.
Yeah.